First, let's discuss the phospholipid bilayer. Biological membranes. Membranes act as barriers that separate the outside environment from an enclosed compartment. They are responsible for compartmentalization in living systems, which is a characteristic of living things. While membranes have a complex composition, the basic structure is a double layer of phospholipids that gather to enclose a volume. Hydrophobic-hydrophilic interactions are what drive the arrangement of phospholipids into lipid bilayers that form membranes. Phospholipids. So these are the individual phospholipids that make up the bilayer of the membrane. Here's what they look like. Phospholipids are derivatives of triglycerides. They are made of one glycerol, two fatty acids, and one phosphate-containing group. So if you look at the image to the right, you can see one glycerol, that's this portion here, two fatty acids, and one phosphate-containing group here. Phospholipids have a hydrophilic end called the hydrophilic head, which you can see here. So the portion containing the phosphate and the glycerol is hydrophilic, and the fatty acids are the hydrophobic tail. So phospholipids as a whole are what we would call amphiphilic. Phospholipid bilayer. So how do those individual phospholipid molecules, like we saw on the first page, form this bilayer? What they do is they form two parallel lines with their hydrophilic heads oriented toward internal and external aqueous environments. So look, here's a hydrophilic head. Here's a hydrophilic head. On this side is some internal aqueous environment, maybe the inside of a cell, let's say. And outside is another aqueous environment, but it's external to, let's say, what's being contained in the cell. Okay? The fatty acid tails that you see here, each one has two fatty acid tails, form a hydrophobic barrier in the middle. So these fatty acid tails line up to all point inward, and that's our nonpolar hydrophobic barrier. Okay, and so what this does is forms a phospholipid bilayer, meaning two layers that excludes water. So we're excluding water from this, and that's what keeps the water aqueous environment on the outside of whatever we're containing separate from the aqueous environment on the inside of whatever we are containing. Selective permeability. Membranes allow for the movement of water and ions, intake of nutrients, and elimination of waste because they are what we call selectively permeable. This means they can let some molecules pass through and not others. Selective permeability allows membranes to maintain internal environments with controlled biochemical compositions and to maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis describes a state of relative equilibrium of physical and chemical processes within a cell. So you can see if this is the internal environment over here, this membrane is allowing for the passage of the bluish green particles, but not the yellow. So we're maintaining an environment over here that if we were to allow these yellow molecules through, would not be the same. Okay, so membranes allow for the movement of particles selectively in order to maintain the homeostasis of that internal environment. There are some molecules that can freely diffuse across a lipid bilayer. and other things that cannot. So as an example, small nonpolar molecules can very freely diffuse across the lipid bilayer, things like carbon dioxide and oxygen. Remember that the inside of this lipid bilayer is nonpolar fatty acids, right? So it would make sense that something that is also nonpolar would be okay to pass through this nonpolar area. Other things are lipid molecules like testosterone or cholesterol will freely pass through for the same reason. Small but polar molecules, so something small like water, can pass through but happens very, very slowly. Large polar molecules, amino acids, glucose, nucleotides, cannot pass through, right? They're too polar once they encounter this fatty acid in the middle. And charged particles like sodium ions, chloride ions, amino acids, also, once they get to where these nonpolar fatty acids are, they can't continue to pass through. So those do not diffuse across the lipid bilayer. Early cell membranes. The formation of a cell membrane, also called plasma membrane, was one of the first steps in the evolution of cells in seawater. Early cells were enclosed by simple fatty acid bilayers that allowed few molecules to pass through. Only small, nonpolar molecules such as oxygen and carbon dioxide pass unimpeded through fatty acid bilayers. Later, cells developed more complex membranes that included cholesterol, proteins, and carbohydrates. Some proteins act as gates, controlling the movement of molecules into and out of the cell. With the help of proteins, polar molecules and charged ions can cross membranes. Regulating the amount of each nutrient and waste crossing the membrane is part of maintaining homeostasis.